Okay, with that, we're going to switch it over to Dan Quinn. Dan is a grad student. He's co-advised by Hannah and myself. Dan is in his third season of collecting data. He came out of Michigan State, where he got his undergrad and graduate degrees, and he's been working on a really good project. It's funded by the corn growers, looking at how to manage nitrogen when you follow a cover crop. So, Dan?
All right, can you hear me all right? Good. All right, so again, I'm a grad student. I work with Hannah and Chad. I'm in my third and final year, so the light is at the end of the tunnel. But following the completion of my PhD next spring, I'll be heading a little bit north for the folks in Indiana that are here. I recently took a position at Purdue, so I'll be the extension corn agronomist at Purdue starting next fall or next spring. I'll be taking over for Bob Nielsen up there, and so it'll be exciting to move up there and hopefully get to keep working with the folks in Kentucky, and hopefully seeing a lot of you at meetings down the road. So kind of the basis of my projects the last few years, this is just one of 3 projects that I've had, is trying to understand how do we manage corn nitrogen when we have a rye cover crop that's implemented. Transition slides here. There we go. So in Kentucky, kind of when I got here, and kind of the basis of these projects really was that a lot of farmers in Kentucky were really interested in using rye as a cover crop. And a lot of that really centers around, conserving that soil and helping with erosion and helping build the organic matter. No-till was started in Kentucky to really capitalize and try and conserve a lot of the shallow soils that Kentucky has, the erosion issues that Kentucky has. And a lot of farmers kind of want to take that to the next level. And rye produces a lot of biomass and grows about anywhere as a cover crop, and it does a good job of really holding that soil in place and helping build those soil levels. And it also really helps with weeds as well. It can limit a lot of the early season weed populations we see. But a lot of farmers were noticing a lot of issues in their corn crop when it followed rye. That can be highlighted in these pictures here. So these pictures were taken last year. This is corn planted following rye, and this is corn planted not following rye. These are taken right next to each other in Lexington, same day. I took these pictures right next to each other. The only difference these two plots have is one has a cover crop and one doesn't. But the corn on your left is significantly more yellow. We're seeing quite a bit more nitrogen stress. We also see decreased vegetative growth in that corn when it is following rye. So some of those issues really stem from rye. One, produces a lot of biomass. It uptakes a lot of nitrogen. It uptakes a lot of moisture as well. That biomass has really high levels of carbon. When you have really high levels of carbon in that rye cover crop, a lot of that nitrogen you apply, especially earlier on in the season, can get what they know is known as immobilized. So it's immobilized in the soil, and that corn just can't use it. Also, this high level of biomass can also contribute, if you're putting your nitrogen on that surface, you can actually lose a lot of volatilization as well. So rye can contribute to some nitrogen stress issues with corn that we've seen. So really the basis behind these projects is trying to understand.
Hey, Dan, I just put you on mute for a second. We were getting some odd audio feedback there. I'm going to try to unmute you and we'll start back up. If you want to back up about 15 seconds on your on what you were talking about. So let me get you back on unmute and let's try this again.
basis for my project.
Dan, we're still getting some feedback. All right, let's pause for just a moment. Do you have if you've got a headset close by, let's try that out, Dan, and see if that'll pick that up. What we will do is, let me mute that for a moment. While Dan is getting that set up, I think what I'll do is go ahead and get into my presentation, and I'll do a short version of it here until I see Dan get back into the screen. That way he's already back. If he gets that plugged in here pretty quickly, we'll just let him go back into it, and we'll have him back up a slide and get into it that way. Considering the number of folks that are on here, we appreciate you all sticking around. We've actually been working pretty good up to this point. I had a little bit of audio issue, but we're fortunate that most of it's working pretty well. Dan, once you're plugged in and good to go, let's go ahead and give another audio check and see if it's feeding through better. Go ahead and give us a test run, Dan.
You hear me now?
Got you now, yes.
Does it sound better?
Much.
Good.
So go ahead and probably just back up to the start of that slide. I think that's about where the sound cut out. So go ahead and pull that slide set back up, wait about 2 seconds, and then start into it.
All right, does it sound better now?
Yes, much better. Go ahead.
Let's try this again. Okay. So really the kind of what I mentioned before is kind of the basis of my research projects were centered around, okay, we have been seeing some nitrogen stress in our corn when it's following rye, and that can be illustrated by these two pictures here. So corn on your left here is following a rye cover crop. Corn on your right is not following a rye cover crop. These pictures were taken the same day. These plots are side by side, and the only difference between these two plots is that one has rye and one doesn't. So corn on your left, it's got visual nitrogen stress, so it's a lot less green. Corn on your right, we also see decreased vegetative growth in that rye cover crop on the left. So when it comes to using a rye cover crop, rye really produces a lot of biomass, and that's one of the pros of using rye. But when it produces a lot of biomass, you get a lot of carbon in that rye biomass. When you have so much carbon in that rye, a lot of times what we see a lot of nitrogen immobilization. So we apply fertilizer early on in the season. That corn just can't take up that nitrogen due to that high amount of carbon in that rye biomass. So a lot of mobilization. Also, with that heavy rye residue, if you're putting your nitrogen on the surface, you can get a lot more volatilization as well. So we're just seeing different ways, different issues with that rye cover crop, specifically when it comes to limiting the amount of nitrogen that's available to the corn crop. So kind of the basis of my project, this one project we have, is trying to understand, okay, what do we do about this nitrogen issue? Is there ways we can manage our nitrogen specifically so that we can limit the nitrogen stress that we're seeing in the corn crop early on in the season? And do we need to change our management practices? Do we need to change the way we apply our nitrogen so we can limit the nitrogen stress we're seeing? And two, allow farmers to use rye without seeing the yield reductions, the nitrogen stress in corn moving forward. So we had 3 locations. I've done this for 3 years, so I'm in my 3rd year here. We had 3 locations across the state of Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky, we've done for 3 years. Glendale, Kentucky for 2 years. That's an on-farm location. And then Princeton, Kentucky for 2 years. So Lexington was no-till. We actually irrigated Lexington, and that was following soybean. Glendale, Kentucky, that was no-till, rain-fed following soybean. And lastly, in Princeton, was a no-till rain-fed following corn. So we really tried to encompass, one, a lot of different locations across the state, and two, a lot of different management practices, a lot of different systems across the state, so we can kind of encompass basically management and locations across the whole state and try and encompass this across all of our data that we collect. So we had three main factors that we looked at specifically in these studies. The first is rye cover crop. We used a rustic cereal rye, which is a very common variety of rye that's used for cover crop use. We seeded that with a drill, about 60 pounds per acre. Comparing that versus no rye cover crop. We chemically terminated that with glyphosate. We shot for about 14 days prior to corn planting, but usually with weather and everything, it ended up being around 21 days prior to corn planting. Then second, we looked at nitrogen fertilizer timing. So we had two different timings on exactly how we applied our nitrogen in these studies. So first timing, we used 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We applied that in a 2x2 starter through the planter at planting. And then we put the remaining amount of nitrogen at pre-plant. So immediately at planting, we put the rest of our nitrogen on. And then secondly, we looked at a split nitrogen application. So again, we used that 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We applied it in a 2x2 starter as well. And the remaining nitrogen was surface banded. We actually waited later in the season, timed around that V6 growth stage. So that'll be referred to as the split when I talk about the next data slides, and then the pre-plant as well. Then we had a total of 6 different nitrogen rates that we looked at in these studies. So all the way from 0 upwards to 270 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So these figures here, what we really want to try and present with these figures is understanding, one, how does the nitrogen timing aspect, so we have across the top here, pre-plant nitrogen and split nitrogen, and the impact of the rye cover crop. So red here is no cover, blue is rye cover, specifically on how corn responds to nitrogen fertilizer. So right here on the y-axis, we have corn yield. So as we move up the y-axis, corn yield's increasing. X-axis, we have nitrogen fertilizer rate. So move left to right, the amount of nitrogen that's applied is increasing. And this is from all 3 locations from the last 2 years. So Glendale here on the left, we have Lexington here in the middle, and then Princeton here on your right. And kind of what the main thing we want to point out to with these figures here is specifically the difference between the 2 timings. So pre-plant N and split N. And specifically in Glendale and Lexington, where we had the highest levels of rye biomass the last couple of years, when I look at pre-plant nitrogen and the difference between no cover and rye cover, across the board, really doesn't matter how much nitrogen I apply, I'm still seeing a yield reduction from that rye cover crop at Glendale when I apply all my nitrogen up front. Same in Lexington as well. We look at the corn response to nitrogen, looking at that difference between no cover, which is the red line, and rye cover, the blue line. I'm still seeing yield reductions when I apply all my nitrogen up front from that rye. So if I apply all my nitrogen up front with a rye cover crop, it really doesn't matter how much nitrogen I'm applying, I'm still seeing a yield reduction from that rye. But we'll switch gears here to that split nitrogen application. And what's kind of interesting, what we've been seeing the last couple of years, is that when I hit a certain level of nitrogen, so this is roughly around 175 pounds of nitrogen per acre, about 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, these 2 lines begin to converge. So that's that split nitrogen application. So if I apply the amount of nitrogen that's generally recommended in the corn crop that I need, and I apply my nitrogen, we aren't seeing that yield reduction in that corn crop when following a rye cover crop. And that's specifically at Glendale, Lexington. Princeton, we did not have the levels of rye biomass last year. This year's a different story. We have much more rye biomass, so we're hoping to kind of see some of these results again in Princeton. But it's important to note that when I apply my nitrogen and I apply a recommended amount of nitrogen, we're really not seeing a yield reduction from that rye cover crop. So in this last figure, the last graph I presented, we broke it out between all the locations. Now, with a lot of my data the last 2 years, and one we'll add in our third year, is we want to combine everything together. We want to take all the data across all these different systems across the state, bring it all together, and help give farmers, this is a general idea, regardless of what management system, regardless of where I'm at in the state. This is a general idea what will happen between the nitrogen timings and the rye cover crop. So this is across all the studies and all the years. Left is the pre-plant nitrogen, on the right is the split nitrogen. And again, similar to the last figure, we have the red is the no cover and the blue is the rye cover. And this is, again, corn grain yield response. So as we increase on the y-axis, corn yield levels increasing. X-axis, we have nitrogen fertilizer rate. Move left to right, the more nitrogen is being applied. And we're seeing this similar trend that we saw in the last figures with when we combine all the data together. When I apply my nitrogen up front as a pre-plant or an at-plant nitrogen application, regardless of how much nitrogen I apply, I'm seeing a significant reduction in yield when corn is following a rye cover crop. But when I move to a split nitrogen application, so I apply 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre at planting, wait until that V6 application, apply the rest of my nitrogen. At the lower nitrogen rates, we're seeing a little bit of a yield reduction in corn. But when we get up to those higher nitrogen rates, those recommended nitrogen rates in corn, we just aren't seeing the significant yield reduction in the corn crop when it is following rye. So overall, what we've seen in the last couple of years with this project is that the split application of nitrogen fertilizer, so that 2x2 plus V6N, provided more pronounced benefit to corn following a rye cover crop compared to the pre-plant N. So when we step back and look at across the board, a split nitrogen application is, in my opinion, what I've seen is probably the best way to go, regardless of whether or not you have a rye cover crop. But you can probably get away with an at-plant or a pre-plant N application without rye. But when I have a rye cover crop in the system, we're just seeing that a split nitrogen application is just better every time when we look at it across all the last 2 years and all the data that we have. So implications for farmers. When following a rye cover crop, farmers should look to incorporate a split application of nitrogen fertilizer, both to improve nitrogen use efficiency in their corn and also reduce the nitrogen fertilizer requirements and also reduce that rye or that corn yield loss when it is following a rye cover crop. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody on this slide here, especially the Kentucky Corn Promotion Council. They funded my research the last 3 years. So they allowed me, I see a few folks from Michigan here. So I'm originally from Michigan. So Kentucky Corn Growers allowed me to come down here, have my projects funded, and able to spend the last 3 years here and get my degree and move on. So I really appreciate their help and really appreciate everyone else on this slide as well. So with that, hopefully my audio worked all right. It wouldn't be a virtual field day without some technical difficulties, but I can take any questions if you have them. Or
Dan, you've got one question about whether you looked at early burn down effect on carbon tie-up.
So we didn't look at, I guess, early burn down. We didn't look at on carbon tie up in the corn specifically. Basically, all we did is we took that rye cover crop biomass samples. We looked at the amount of carbon, the amount of nitrogen they have, and then take that ratio and try and estimate maybe whether or not there was some specific tie up. But we haven't looked at early termination. We are looking at really extremely late. We're actually planting green in that cover crop and looking at how that can influence carbon nitrogen ratio and potential tie up as well.
All right, hopefully everyone can hear me. Just Chad said, I'm not sure how many people understood. I'm Carrie Knott, I'm the grain crops agronomist stationed here at UKRAC in Princeton. And so I'm just going to take a few moments to talk about some sort of management and community. I'm probably going to focus this morning. I'm going to focus this morning on, let me see, trying my audio as well. Is that better, everyone? So I am going to focus on some research we've done the last 3 to 4 years on crop soybean management, where we were looking, our student was looking at intensive management. So is it going to pay off? What can we do? We increase yields of double crop soybeans with different agronomic sort of practices. And so really what we did, and for those of you that have been to the field days the last few years, you've seen Catherine, my student, present sort of preliminary results. Actually, these are the final results of the 3 years of data. And what we were looking at was sort of this base treatment, where we were looking at a seeding rate of about 150,000 seeds per acre. We, of course, in double crop soybeans, we do not recommend a seed treatment, so we had no seed treatment. And we only applied foliar pesticide applications, which would have been Quadras Top or Warrior 2 with Xeon technology as needed. So that was based upon our university thresholds. And from there, we just kind of started adding some treatments. We had the base with seed treatment, we had the base with seed treatment, and then just a blanket application at R3 of those foliar pesticides. From there, we just started looking at higher seeding rates, which I know in the past, these seeding rates for double crop have occurred, but we've backed down quite a bit. So we really were hoping that this would be an extremely large seeding rate, okay? Then, of course, we add the seed treatment and stack it up with the R3 as well. Based upon 3 years of data, we did this for 4 years, but the first year was a preliminary year. So the year that had all these treatments was from 2017 to 2018. And what we found is that when we harvested following wheat at about 18 to 20% moisture, we had a higher yield. And so this isn't really ground shattering information, right? We know if we plant earlier, we're going to get higher yields. And in most cases, the average of these two planting dates was about 10 to 12 days difference. There was actually 1 year we had 3 weeks span, and that had to do with significant rain that came in after that first harvest that kept us out of the field until probably July 7th or so. And so that really impacted this yield. And so it's kind of nice to see that some older data that said with double crop soybeans, you can expect about a bushel per day of loss. And so we're really finding that as well, because we on average had about 10-day difference between this early and normal. When we started looking at seeding rates, we were a little surprised by this finding, in that when we seeded at 150,000 versus the 225, we also had much lower yields, okay? This surprised us until we started looking at our harvest populations. And when we, just prior to harvest, we estimated the population, what we found is that at 150,000, we were only harvesting 115,000 plants per acre. For double crop soybeans, we know that about 140 to 150 is really that target population that we want to be harvesting. And so it wasn't until we got up to that 225 that we really attained the minimum harvest population that we recommend. And I'll be honest, I'm really surprised that we had so much stand loss, because we did account for the germination. And so we still don't quite understand what happened to all this stand that we had early season and how we lost it. Possibly it could be due to these excessive seeding rates and the plants just sort of getting smothered out. But we really don't know at this point what that was. In terms of seed treatment, we really weren't surprised by this. There was no yield advantage between using seed treatment and not in the double crop system. We did have one year that maybe it was starting to look like we were going to see some advantages, but that year was extremely wet and we just kept having rains, which was a good problem to have. But the soil conditions stayed saturated. It was a little bit cooler that year. And so that's not that surprising, right? We know cool, wetter soils, seed treatments will probably be beneficial. Next, we looked at that R3 sort of blanket application or prophylactic application versus as needed. And so from 2018 to 2019, we were able to get these on as needed versus the prophylactic. So in 2018, we really only needed the insecticide application, and I think that was at about an R4 application. Last year, 2019, we went ahead and applied an insecticide, and then I think the following week we applied a fungicide because the weather conditions were looking very conducive for frog eye leaf spot development, and also we were starting to get some infections and infestations of that disease as well. And so what we found is that overall, and again, those were about an R4 application as well, between R3 and R4. And so they were just a little bit later than that blanket R3. But we're very surprised in that we were seeing a yield advantage of about 4 bushels. So agronomically, I'm pretty excited about that information. And we're probably going to do some additional testing on that. And so if we look at these treatments, and so again, I'm just showing these real quick to remind you of the actual treatments themselves. And we look at sort of the yield advantage, we see that really it was this highest, most intensive management treatment that gave us the highest yield of 61 bushels per acre on average. And then followed by about a 56 bushel per acre for that lesser managed. So as an agronomist, it was interesting to see that we could sort of bump our yields by 10 bushels. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is, does it pay? And I'm not going to address that at all. Thankfully, Jordan Shockley is going to be on right after me, and he's going to talk about this data in terms of whether or not you get your return on investment. But like I said, as an agronomist, we were pretty excited to see that we could kind of tweak these double crop soybean yields just a bit. With that, I just wanted to say thank you. I did forget to mention up front that Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board did fund all of these years of research, but their logo was at the top. They've graciously continued to support an additional project where we're going to test R3, blanket R3 applications in a full season and double crop system as well. And just see if we can continue to see that trend and just make sure that nothing's changed and that our university recommendations don't need to be tweaked just a little bit to make sure that we get the best advice to you guys. With that, I'm going to stop. I had a few more slides, but if you want to see what those were about, they were about some full season stuff. Information, you can maybe look at the recordings that we'll have later. So with that, were there any questions in the chat, Colette? Okay. If you guys think of questions, please text me. I think Colette put my number in the chat box. Many of you have my number as well. Thank you guys so much for logging on. Please know that we understand how painful these Zoom meetings can be. We would rather have you in person, sweating it out with us, but it's just not possible. And so thank you all for joining. And if you have questions, please let me know at any time.
Topic, we're switching to one of our researchers, Dr. Montse Salmeron. Montse is originally from Spain. She is a crop physiologist, and so she really studies the growth and development of corn and soybeans and tries to understand those factors. Where Carrie and I are agronomists, and we're trying to look at the overall production system and how things impact that. Montse's really studying how the crop grows, how it develops, and what drives some of that. So some of her research is extremely helpful to us in some of our applied extension activities that we do. Also, if you didn't see your location listed in the poll questions, if you would, now that we've got the chat up again, go ahead and stick in that chat where you're from. Town and state are fine if you want to do it that way. But with that, I will turn this over to Montse and let her go from there.
Thank you, Chad. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to all of you today. So I'll be presenting about the effect of planting date in soybean and some tools for producers, and in particular, I will focus on predictive tools that have the advantage that can look at the effect of many years of data. And this is particularly helpful in Kentucky, where precipitation can change greatly from one year to the other. I wanted to start by showing the results. This is from the crop progress report. And we can see that, in fact, planting dates are happening earlier every year in Kentucky for both soybean and corn. In Kentucky, we see that you're planting 0.32 days earlier every year, and corn is being planted 0.27 days earlier every year. And this is because planting date is one of the main factors that can increase soybean yields. Research that looks at different management factors find that this is the single factor that has the most impact in soybean and yield of other grain crops. So we see that when we delay planting date, this has a negative effect on soybean yields. In this, Carrie was mentioning some values on the decrease in yield when we delay planting date. These are results from irrigated trials conducted in Lexington, Kentucky for the last 3 years, where we had a May and a June planting date, and the yields that we get with those two planting dates. And in red, I'm showing the yield decline when we delay planting date. And this is estimated yield decline, in this case, per 10 days of delay. So that yield decline range from 2.5 bushels per acre to 5.7 bushels per acre when planting date was delayed by 10 days. And these trials were irrigated. I'm also including some data from a Mid-South planting date study where the decrease in yield ranged from 0 to 13 bushels per acre per 10-day delay. So it was very variable depending on the location and the maturity group. Most likely for our latitude and maturity groups, we will expect 1.6 to 8 bushels per acre per 10 days of every time that we delay planting day by 10 days after May. And these are results from the same trials in Lexington, but under rain-fed conditions. So what we saw under rain-fed conditions is that the decline in yield when we delay planting date was lower. So in 2017 and 19, it was 1.8 and 1.3 bushels per acre per each 10-day delay in planting date. However, in 2018, this was the most wet year where we didn't see a response to irrigation. And in this case, the yield decline was very similar to irrigated conditions. So overall, what we see is that we can expect 3 to 6 bushels per hectare decline when we delay planting day by 10 days in our latitude. However, under rain-fed conditions, it's going to be more variable, and we can expect the yield decline to be less. However, again, the results are going to change from year to year. So I wanted to continue explaining briefly what determines these yield differences, this yield decline as planting date is delayed. This is the solar radiation intensity on clear sky. So we see that the radiation intensity peaks in the summer solstice, and after that will decline. And here I'm showing the horizontal lines is the growing season for early maturity group 4, planted in mid-April, May or June. So what we can see is that by the start of flowering, when planted in April, it's close to the summer solstice. But as we delay planting date, the reproductive stages occur later in the growing season when the solar radiation intensity is lower. So this has a strong impact, decreasing yields. So we summarize the factors that are going to influence yields that explain this decrease. One is this reduction in solar radiation intensity during the reproductive stages when the pod number is determined and when seed filling occurs. But also we have a strong decrease in the duration of the growing season. This is because soybean is a short day plant. So as we delay planting date, the crop is going to be exposed to reduced number of day length or hours of light, and that has an effect decreasing the duration of the growing season in soybean. So as you see, the growing season is reduced for more than a month when planting date is delayed from April to June. And finally, we also have the late reproductive stages occurring later in the season, so we have a higher chance of low temperatures that could be detrimental during seed fill. So, but what is the optimum planting date for soybean? So when these are results from a regional planting date study in the Mid-South from the northernmost location in that study. This is in Columbia, Missouri. And what we see is that often we see a quadratic response to planting date, linear or quadratic, where yield is going to decline, but when we advance further planting date beyond a date, we don't see further gain in yield. So when we looked at the optimum planting dates, in this figure, I summarized the data from the locations closer to Kentucky from this regional study, and these graphs show data from Milan, Tennessee, and Columbia, Missouri. The horizontal lines show the optimum planting date where we wouldn't where we will get the maximum yields for each soybean maturity group. So in Milan, Tennessee, we will get optimum yields, maximum yields in early May with maturity groups 3 to 5. However, with the maturity group 6, we had a wider optimum planting date, but yields were also lower on average. In Columbia, Missouri, the optimum planting date ranged from late April to early June, with maturity groups 3 yielding the highest. So in Kentucky, based on the results expected in Kentucky, we can have optimum planting dates that range from late April to late May. And this is a question that we're wanting to address. We know that yields are going to decline, but we want to know how soon we can plant soybeans and still get yield advantage. So we are conducting trials that had trials with May and June planting dates during the last 3 years, and this year we also included an April planting date. Unfortunately, we had freezing this year that damaged the April planting date. And I'll talk about the freeze risk later in the talk in a moment. But we are looking at the yield response to planting date under both irrigated and rain-fed conditions, because we see there's an interaction and we can expect different response, and also with different soybean maturity groups. Because some maturity groups might be more favorable under different planting dates. And these are some of the steps with these studies. We are going to combine the field trials with predictive tools that allow to expand results to study more years and a wider range of planting dates. And these are preliminary results from the calibrated crop model that show how yield decrease when we delay planting date, but also that optimum planting dates, for instance, in Bowling Green, Kentucky, might be in early May for maturity groups 3 and earlier for maturity group 4. However, we need to further calibrate with data from this year, the simulations. Another interesting thing that we see is that when we plant in late May or early June, the differences between different maturity groups tend to be small, but when we plant earlier, we may expect more differences, and it becomes more important to select an optimum cultivar maturity group choice for that planting date. So the next step is to further calibrate the model with the field data so that we get more robust results, and then combine the simulations from many years with an economic analysis so that we can see, for instance, when we plant earlier, we might have risk of freezing or low yields in some years, but depending on the frequency and the risk of that freezing, it might be still more economically advantageous to plant earlier. Another tool I want, another tool I wanted to talk about is based on model simulations, is a phenology tool. This one is already available and is based on model simulations I worked on previously from the study in the Mid-South. So you can use this link to access the tool. And I'll do an example. So on one hand, you have phenology maps. So we can select, for instance, if we were to plant in mid-May, when you scroll over the map,
hey Monte,
it shows.
we can't see that. We can't see the website.
You cannot see? Okay. What about now?
Yes.
Okay. So let me just start over. So when you go to home, we click the link, you can go to phenology maps, and this will show data from 30 years of weather data, results from 30 years of simulations. And we can select, for instance, an mid-May planting date. And the color shows the risk of freezing. So we are at that 20% risk of freezing when we plant in May, when we have an emergence date in May 16. So I guess we're unlucky to have freezing this year. And it also shows, when you scroll through the figure, the time of flowering. So for instance, for an early maturity group 3, we will expect R1 to occur just before the summer solstice. If we delay to a late maturity group 4, we will expect flowering just to be delayed for a week. But you can also look at the end of the growing season, and this can help you see what maturity group will adjust better to your environmental conditions and what reproductive stages will be at the peak of solar radiation. Another tool that you can access here is, because these are results from 30 years, but you can go to results from the current year and select input your postal code, select a maturity group, the emergence date, and it takes a second. But it will output the expected timing of different developmental stages. So this was for an emergence in June, so this has already occurred, and in blue, and in yellow is the expected timing of the different developmental stages. You can see below the projection for this year, and also based on 30 years of weather data. So with this tool, you can see what the risk of freeze, timing of developmental stages, and you can select what maturity group might adjust, meet better the peak of high solar radiation intensity during reproductive stages. So this tool is already available, and you can access anytime when input your location, and it will calculate the timing with weather data from a nearby weather station to your location. With this, I'm finishing, and I would like to take any question that you may have.
Yeah, let's get into some late planted corn and potential effects on yields. Back when we were putting this together, there was a look like we might get very late in planting. We were actually very early on. If you look at this red graph in here, the red line from USDA NASS is showing us that we had some, early on, we were very much ahead in planting, and then we hit into several rain events that took us out of the field for a couple of weeks and really slowed things down. We still ended up with almost 90% planted at June 1. That's a little bit under our 5-year average, but it was actually not that far off of what we saw in 2019. And so we've seen a couple of years here in a row where we're getting some corn planted into June in the state. And historically that you might think, well, that's just mostly silage corn, but that's not the case. There's actually some field corn that's getting into this category. And so we were curious about some of those issues there of what might happen in that type of scenario. But before I get over into the late planted question, I wanted to get into just planting dates in general. And so several years ago, I asked several farmers around the state to just send me planting dates and yields and acreages from their fields. And we took every field that I think was above 20 acres in size, and we put them all together into one graph to look at just planting date and corn yield, just to give us a better idea about what farmers were actually seeing in the field from season to season. This particular data set goes from 2003 to 2011. This is off of farmers' fields in central Kentucky. When we just pulled that grouping, we have a little bit of data from other parts of the state, but we had the majority of the data that came to us from this area of the state. And so I did the initial cut on the data, and then Dan put it into a really nice graph. And so that's what we're sharing with you here. If you look at this data set and fit this particular curve to it, what it suggests is that our ideal planting date starts somewhere around April 26th or 27th. And then really out until about June 2nd, we pretty much have a flat curve. We've got a plateau at this point. And so if you look at the actual data points, you can see that we have some really high yields. So these are relative grain yields. So what we did is each year, yields were a little bit different from year to year. And so we looked at the highest yield within a year, set that to 1, and then adjusted everything else accordingly. And you can see across that very top line, that 1, that we have some early April planting dates that got us to the high yield all the way out into the June planting dates to get us into the high yield category. And then you can see there's a massive range, and some of those early plantings where we've got lower yields, we may have had a freeze event come in or something, or maybe some other weather events that came in and hurt some of those yields early on, maybe some stand reductions for some other reasons. But overall, if you look at this, what it's suggesting to us is, at least over that period of time, while we talk about April 15th as a start date for planting for Central Kentucky, it looked like we were much better off to get into that last week of April and the first couple weeks of May. So that would suggest that maybe we shouldn't push planting dates as much as we think on the corn side. Now, with that in mind, let's get into just looking at some later planting. And so we did a couple of studies. We got most of our research that we got at Lexington planted ended up being on May 15th. We had a lot of starts and stops this year. We actually had a field, I think it was 2 weeks before this, Dan, where we planted a field. It was too wet, and so Dan made 2 passes with the planter. We put the planter back up. We came back out 2 weeks later, planted some crops, and sure enough, where we were out there 2 weeks earlier, we got sidewall compaction. And the 2 weeks in planting difference was only 1 growth stage in planting difference. And so May 15th became our on time or early planting date for this year. Then we had one we did at June 8th, and we did another one at June 18th. And so the June 8th planting date is our late corn, and then the June 18th is the late corn. Hopefully we don't get into a copyright infringement with anyone on those categories, but that's what we're calling them for now. Now, if you look at this image, this was taken on July 7th, and in July 7th, the early corn, or the on-time corn, it's got leaf rolling going on. It's showing some signs of drought stress. The other 2 planting dates are not, and this is reflective of this corn was at V11, and it's at a higher demand for water than corn at V6 or V4. These are all studies that are side by side. In fact, if you look at the V6 image in the left, you can see the taller corn sort of off to the left in that image. That's the corn that you see in the first picture at V11. So this is all in that same field, same soil type, and same rotation, just differences in planting date. And so we're already seeing that the early planting date is going through a little bit more drought stress at that point in time. It gives us some indication of the water demand that we see as we get into peak water demand, which is right about now for most of the corn in the state. If we fast forward to July 15th, now the early corn, or the on-time corn's at V14, the June 8th corn's at V8, the June 18th is sitting at V6. And in this particular image, that particular day, not too much drought stress, maybe a little bit of curling at the very top of the leaves on the V14 corn. But otherwise, the crop overall had a couple rainfall events and was looking pretty good at this point. Now, both that V8 and V6 corn have now started reproductive development. The growing points above ground at V6 by V8, that dominant ear and the tassel have been formed or starting their formation. And so any type of stress that goes on from this point out could affect reproductive development, could affect that ear, could affect the tassel. A lot of your herbicides tend to have cutoff somewhere between V6 and V8 in there as well. So those are some of the things that we're concerned about. And then on July 20th, yesterday, Julia Santoro, who works with my group, took these images. And so now that May 15th corn is at tassel. It's at its peak water demand. Any type of water stress right now is lethal to the crop. It's harmful to pollination. 100% hail damage at this point would give us 0 yields. The corn crop is requiring roughly 3/10 of an inch of water a day right in through here. And so it's at very, very high demand for water. And if you look across the state, a lot of our corn is somewhere around VTR1 to R2. So it puts a tremendous amount of our crop at peak water demand right now. Over these next couple of weeks, this will really tell us what kind of crop we're going to end up with. And the other 2 are up to V10 and V8. And so they're slowly catching up. And so what Julia has done with some help from Ryan Murphy and some help from Dan as well, Ryan's an undergrad student working for us, They went in and they've been monitoring growth stages, and they're also looking at growing degree day accumulations. And so the blue line shows you the May 15th planting date, and you can see we're right up to VT. We've taken quite a few heat units to get there. This is more heat units than what it suggests the hybrid needs, but we've got a lot of heat units in here. And if you look at both the June plantings, you can see that they are hitting growth stages faster than what the May 15th corn did. And so one, we're getting a little bit more growing degree day accumulation because we're just simply getting warmer into July, late June and into July. But secondly, those two later planting dates are developing through the growth stages quicker than what the early corn did. And by quicker, quicker in time, but also taking fewer growing degree day units to get to those growth stages than the corn planted earlier. I want to double check that bottom graph. I think we're pulling data off of the UK Ag Weather Center's corn growing degree day calculation. I want to double check those values because those do seem quite a bit high for what a crop needs at this point in time with the growth stage. But either way, the relative difference is what to pay attention to here. And so corn that gets in late, that's certainly something that we often see is it tends to catch up or grow a little bit faster. And these two June planting dates are certainly showing us that they're growing faster in terms of number of days. They're also growing faster in terms of taking fewer heat units to get to each growth stage. That's important because we base a lot of crop growth and development on corn off of these heat units. And there's clearly some other factors that help determine that, not just the heat units. But here's part of the challenge. And so you can see right now, this is looking at the drought monitor for the Midwest. This was last Thursday. The next one will come out on this coming Thursday. And so we'll see what the update shows us. You can see a good chunk of the Midwest, half of Iowa, a lot of Indiana, a good amount of Ohio are all going through abnormally dry situations. Parts of Iowa are into moderate drought already last week. And each of these states have been tracking that way now for about 3 weeks. I think Missouri just popped up to abnormally dry last week. So far, Kentucky has been, thankfully, we've been okay in terms of our water, but the challenge is we've also been hot. And so this was the max temperature taken basically ending the morning of 7/20. So the morning, yesterday morning, looking at the max temperature the day before, and we're well into the 90s. Our min temperatures are good, so we're doing okay on the minimum temperature side. We'd like to see those a little bit lower, ideally to help with corn. But these max temperatures mean that we don't just need adequate moisture, we probably need above adequate moisture to try to keep up with the temperature demands that we're seeing in that situation. So you asked me which is the best planting date to use. I mean, historically, the May 15th planting date should be the best, but that crop is going through pollination right now. And those later planting dates, if we caught a break in weather, we had a little bit of a dip in the temperature, maybe a little more rainfall, I mean, they have a chance to actually have a decent pollination, maybe go through a bit less stress in there. And so that gets us to maybe this final point on yield factors. While planting date is certainly a factor in determining yield, there's a lot of other factors that come into play. Planting conditions, I mentioned earlier, sidewall compaction. We could have planted even 2 weeks earlier, that 1st of May, but we would have caused sidewall compaction, and that corn would have been behind from the start, would not have been nearly as good as any of the planting dates that I just showed you. Weed control is a big player, and you're going to hear some more about that next week. If you got weed competition in there, a lot of this other stuff doesn't really matter at that point. At this point in time, weeds will compete for light. They certainly compete for water. We don't need additional water competition right now over the last couple of weeks of what we've been dealing with. Diseases, insects, nutrient availability, which Edwin discussed. Kirsten talked about the diseases, southern rust, if it comes in. Those later planted corns are much higher risk for problems with southern rust just because of where they are in their development stages. It's probably something we're going to have to monitor on those 2 late planting dates. And if we don't control southern rust in those 2 late planting dates, I would suspect they would be hurt tremendously more by the southern rust that's coming in right now. Soil compaction is a big one. We sort of mentioned that one with the sidewall compaction. If you get soil compaction in the field, everything else doesn't matter. It will trump anything else you're trying to do. Certainly cloud cover, rainfall timeliness, rainfall amount, your daytime temperature, your night temperatures, your relative humidity. The dew that we're getting in the mornings right now is extremely helpful for most of the state. And then things we don't have as much control of are deer. Deer are a big problem, particularly on smaller fields. You know, we have about 1.5 million acres of corn in Kentucky. We've got somewhere around 12 million acres of wooded area. And so particularly these smaller fields essentially are food plots for deer. And so that's a massive challenge for some growers around the state. And we've got a specialist working on some of those issues. And then things like hail and some other factors in there as well. So all of these factors go together to affect what our final corn yield is. But when you put them all together and you assume that you're controlling for all of these as best as possible, we'd certainly want to be in that April, May planting date for most of the state, depending upon where you are. Except when we look at that farmer data, it suggests maybe we should be at the later end of our windows for planting rather than the early end. Or look at it a different way. If the weather's good and it's early and we're able to plant, we go ahead and plant. But if the weather's bad, not to stress out about it. We still have a chance to get good yield potential as we get later into that window for planting. And so and if we do plant late, you know, that later corn will catch up a little bit in there. And ultimately on any of these crops, it's getting that good, the good temperatures, rainfalls during seed fill. The other issue on late planted corn would be if that corn's trying to go through field dry down. As the days get shorter and the temperatures get a lot cooler, field dry down becomes more complicated. And so anybody that planted corn in May or in June, anybody who planted corn in June probably needs to assume they're going to need to harvest corn wet and get it dried. To assume they can get it to field dry properly and maintain good quality is probably too high of a risk. We really, really appreciate your attendance. Now the question is, do all of those inputs actually pay?
That's a Jordan question.
And that gets us to Dr. Jordan Shockley. And so Jordan, if you would start bringing stuff up. As I tried to say earlier when my audio was garbled, we really appreciate the Kentucky Corn Growers and the Kentucky Soybean Board for typically sponsoring the lunch, for sponsoring some of the research, helping with some of the outreach that we do as well. And then I was also mentioning we've got a new agreement with Kentucky Farm Bureau on a water quality initiative. We're hoping to have some of that research data in next year's field day. We appreciate their commitment to water quality, making sure that farmers have access to water that they need for their crops and their livestock, but also making sure that the farmers are being good stewards of that as well. So with that, we'll get back right into the very next talk, and that is Dr. Jordan Shockley in Ag Economics. Jordan, welcome today.
Thank you, Chad. Appreciate being here. And like everybody, I wish we were out in the field today talking, but unfortunately, times are a little bit different. So as Carrie alluded to, today I'll try to that question of, do those double crop soybean management strategies pay? So what we'll go through here real quick is briefly touch on some economic tools on how we evaluate these various management strategies that you could do yourself. Then we're going to discuss those intensive management economics, and then we'll discuss planting and harvest timing, that if you attended the wheat field day meeting virtually, you'll see some of that results as well. So how do we evaluate these strategies? Well, the key thing here that we can do is partial budgets. These are really convenient and practical methods that we use to analyze profit potentials to changes in our overall farm plan or management strategies. What we're really looking at here is changes to one alternative. So that's really what is being done now compared to something new. For example, increasing seeding rates in double crop soybeans. You currently have your set of soybean planting rates. If you're going to increase those, what's that alternative look like? And really what we focus on here is the cost and benefits that you realize. So we have a kind of formal partial budget framework that we use, and you can see up in the top left corner there, I believe that's probably the way it's going to look coming across the screen. You have your additional costs. So that is the additional costs that is compared to what you're doing now to the proposed alternative change. So that would be, if you use the same example as increasing seeding rates, that would be your additional seed cost, for example. Then we have reduced revenue. So does that change reduce revenue or income into the farm? Then we have additional revenue up on the top screen or top right. That would be basically, for example, increased yields. And then we have reduced costs. So do you have any cost savings based on whatever alternative measure you are evaluating? So then we take the left columns there and get your total additional cost, the right column there, your total additional revenue, and basically subtract cost from revenues to come up with a number. This is usually on a per acre basis. And so obviously if this is a positive per acre change, this is a good alternative to potentially undertake. Now there are other things to consider rather than just economic returns. Something new we're going to discuss, if you've seen me present in your county over the past 5 years, I've always kind of tried to throw in this partial budget discussion, but one of the things that we need to also think about is economic risk, okay? And when we think about economic risk, there are 5 categories of economic risk, but what we'll focus here today is on what's called production risk. So one of the easiest examples to think about is weather, right? Weather is a production risk. We've been talking about it today already with the rainfall over the past 4 years on these double crop soybeans. So how does these risk events impact your decision making, right? But if you can't measure the risk, it's hard to manage, right? So if you think about it, one way is you as farm managers need to think about is how do we analyze risks? Okay, one of those things to think about is how do we form expectations? So if you think about even planning for the next year, right? What would you expect your soybean or corn yields to be next year, right? Those are typically based on historical farm records and what you've done and what's happened in the past, say 3 to 5 years. But what also we can use is what probabilities, right? Think about rolling a dice, right? Probability of, rolling a 1 or 6 or 5 is 1 in 6, right? So how do we use these probabilities to make decisions on the farm? And then how do we analyze kind of the whole distribution of outcomes? Because there's something we've all seen, and that's that risk return trade-off, right? If something is not very risky, but has also a good payout on a per acre basis, we need to take those into consideration, both profitability and the risk of that, making that alternative decision, okay? So how do we put these into practice, right? Both these evaluating the economics and the risk potential of alternative soybean management strategies. So as we just saw with Carrie's presentation, I won't belabor this too much on the seeding rates, okay, seed treatments, the foliar pesticide application, okay, and then what we will be using is soybean prices of $8.50 per bushel to evaluate the profitability of these alternative intensive management treatments. So again, Carrie put this up there. You can see there was from an agronomic perspective, an increase in yields for all of these management strategies compared to our base case scenario. But again, we need to think about, does it pay? So what we'll do is put those measures into a partial budget framework and look at on a per acre basis to see if it does pay. So we've outlined each treatment here. And again, if you think about this as a proposed change to the alternative, right? Our base case would be what we're doing now. So that would be blanks, because no additional costs, no additional revenues. So we're comparing all of these treatments to the base case. So you can see the base case plus a ST would be seed treatment. Okay, you can see actually there's a negative net return there. Same thing with seed treatment plus that pesticide application. Here we have the high seeding rate plus the seed treatment, and the high seeding rate plus seed treatment plus that pesticide application. And you can see here the two management strategies that on average had a positive net return as compared to what we're doing now is the seed treatment at $9.85 an acre, as well as the high seeding rate plus seed treatment plus the pesticide application. They're at 90 cents an acre. Okay, so while they all increased yields from an agronomic perspective, we need to consider the economic costs and additional revenue to determine whether or not these will pay or not. So something new that I've been doing and presenting to producers throughout a lot of these agronomic studies that are conducted by my colleagues here at the College of Ag. There are numerous samples being taken. And so what we've done is broken this down to show you all the samples, not just the average, and putting the economics to every single sample. And so you can see here, what we've done is the base plus seed treatment plus the pesticide application has a 35% chance. So here's your probabilities coming into play. 35% chance of having a positive net return compared to our base scenario. However, if you look at the high seeding rate, okay, this is actually 58% probability of returning having a positive economic return on a per acre basis. So that's good. So if you look at all the probabilities of being greater than zero return, you can see all of the alternative options here, management strategies, and you can see again the high seeding rate not only has the highest on average return, but also has the highest probability to pay. Okay. So changing a little bit, we also looked at planting and harvest timing. Okay. And so Carrie briefly mentioned some stuff on that. Again, we looked at early October, November wheat planting, but really we also focus here is on the soybeans. So that's normal planting or earlier planting. So that means actually early and normal wheat harvests. So what we looked at, you have to, when looking at these management strategies, look at the combination of the wheat, soybean, double crop soybean system, right? Because if you're planting soybeans early, that means you're harvesting wheat early, right? And so that has to be dried, stored potentially, and there could be some dockage for test weight and or any other dockages there. So You can see here we used again that $8.50 soybean price and $5.25 wheat, and we had a drying cost for earlier harvested wheat at 5 cents a bushel point removed. So if we look here, here's same partial budgets, right? Those late planted wheat in November definitely did not pay. But what did pay, and paid a pretty good amount, was that October planting of wheat, but then the early harvest, early planting of soybeans, because you get that additional soybean yield bump, and that netted out to $35 an acre, which is pretty substantial. So if you look at, again, the economic risk here, there's a 58% probability of a positive return over all those samples across the 3 years for October planting and early harvest and storage and drying of that wheat crop. On the other hand, you look at the risk potential here of that November planting with normal harvest, that only returns 13% of the time. And again, here's another distribution and probability with that early harvest, 23%, but planting late in November for wheat crop. So if you look at those probabilities of breaking even, okay, there's a 58% chance there's that highest probability to pay is that October planting of wheat and that early harvest or early planting of soybeans. So in summary, we can use these partial budget techniques to evaluate our alternative management strategies. Okay, consider those risk returns for each management strategy. High seeding rate for double crop soybean management has potential, and our October planting and early harvest wheat has potential when drying and storing. One thing I want to preface is, if we think about these management strategies, right? How could they be more profitable? As you can imagine, as our grain prices, in this case, double crop soybean prices and wheat prices increase, this could, if we had $10 soybean prices, these could be more profitable, or that our input costs are lower. That means our seeding costs are lower, could provide even more profitability potential. But this evaluation was static at set prices, but you can imagine how these could change to be more profitable management strategies based on varying prices that you see. So with that, I'll take any questions. Here's my contact information, and I'll, like most of us, I'll be on for the remainder of the presentation and to answer any questions.
Jordan, thank you very much. We appreciate that information. I think that's to display it in that way where you look at the probability of getting the increase. Probably a few farmers that if they see greater than 50% chance of gaining value, they're probably going to take that, would be my guess. That's another question for another day of just exactly what level of probability do you accept for different management practices that you work with. I think Jordan's starting down a really interesting path that we may need to look at together in some future research reports that we do. So
I agree, Chad. And I think this was all driven by conversations with farmers on anecdotally, okay, if this practice only paid once every 5 years, would you do it? And again, it depends on okay, in once every 5 years, is that, do I get $5 an acre and lose $10 an acre? Or is this a $50 an acre gain versus $5 cost, right? And so I think we need to bring this more to light and have this conversation. And I'm excited about bringing some of these risk attitudes that we see by farmers, because I think farmers are risk takers, right? And that's just my personal opinion, because we see it every day on the decisions that they make. Is it 50%? Is it 25%? I guess it's a combination of risk and return, right? And so the more we could shed some light and bring some of this information to producers, I think they can hopefully make better management decisions.